What really happened after Moses died? Most people know how his story ends, alone on Mount Nebo, gazing into the promised land he would never enter. But what happened next is rarely told, and it will leave you stunned. The moment Moses drew his final breath, heaven moved. God did something no one expected. Israel responded in a way no one predicted. And what followed was not just historical, it was deeply prophetic. In this video, we uncover 5 shocking events that unfolded immediately after Moses' death, from a burial performed by God himself to a nation brought to stillness, to a new leader rising with divine fire, and the miraculous moment Israel stood on the edge of destiny. These are the hidden chapters between Moses and the Promised Land, and once you see them, you'll never read the story the same way again. So if you're ready to be moved, surprised, and inspired by what Scripture really reveals, then watch until the very end. And if this video brings you insight or deeper faith, please take a moment to like, share it with someone, subscribe for more powerful biblical revelations, and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what spoke to you the most. Let's step into this moment of divine transition together. It all began on a lonely mountain. It is one of the most sacred and mysterious moments in all of Scripture, a moment that defies tradition, expectation, and even human comprehension. After 40 years of leading Israel through wilderness trials, bitter rebellions, and divine revelations, Moses climbed Mount Nebo one final time. The prophet who had once faced Pharaoh, who had split the Red Sea with a rod, who had spoken face to face with God atop Sinai. This same man now ascended alone, not to receive law or command, but to meet his end. The Bible tells us that he was 120 years old, yet his eyes had not dimmed and his strength had not waned. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 7. This was not a frail old man. This was a prophet still ablaze with purpose, clear-eyed, upright, vigorous in both body and spirit. But even the strongest servants must one day lay down their work. From the summit of Mount Nebo, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, God allowed Moses to see the promised land, a land he had longed for, preached about, marched toward, but would never enter. He saw Jericho, the hills of Judah, the lands stretching to the sea. Every promise spoken to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was now visible to his eyes, but they would remain just out of reach. This was not a punishment, it was a divine boundary. His mission was complete, but his feet would not touch the inheritance. That task would belong to another. And then, in a stunning and intimate silence, Moses died there, on the mountain of vision. Not in the presence of his people, not before the eyes of the priests. He died alone, with only God beside him. And it is here that Scripture delivers one of its most shocking and awe-inspiring statements. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 6. God himself buried Moses. No other figure in biblical history received such a burial. Not Abraham, not David, not Elijah. This was not a ceremonial rite performed by priests. There was no procession of elders, no incense, no grave clothes. The Creator of the universe personally laid his servant to rest. This divine burial raises profound questions. Why did God choose to bury Moses in secret? Why was his grave hidden, his body unrecoverable? The answers are layered with spiritual significance. Some believe that God concealed the location to prevent idolatry. Had the Israelites known where Moses was buried, they might have built a shrine, a holy site, or even begun worshipping his bones. After all, this was the man who had brought down the 10 Commandments, who had called down plagues, who had seen God's glory. The temptation to venerate him beyond what was proper would have been strong, and so God removed that possibility by veiling his final resting place in mystery. Others see in this hidden burial a deeper message. Moses belonged to God, in life and in death. His legacy was not meant to rest in stone or earth, but in the hearts of generations to come. The law he carried, the covenant he delivered, those would outlive the dust of his body. But above all, this quiet burial reveals something rare, a divine tenderness. Moses had stood alone so many times, against Pharaoh, against the murmuring of Israel, even in intercession before God himself. And now, at the end of his journey, he did not die alone. He died in the arms of the one who had called him. What a breathtaking reversal. The God who once declared, "No one can see my face and live," now gently receives the face of his friend in death. This was not a dismissal. This was a divine honor, a holy farewell. The end of Moses' life was not marked by spectacle but by sacred secrecy. No trumpet announced it. No human hand recorded it. The final chapter of his life was written by God himself. And this stunning moment marked not just the death of a man, but the end of an age. The end of wilderness wandering. The end of prophetic leadership as Israel had known it. The torch was about to pass, a new leader would rise, a new era would begin. But before that, God paused to bury his servant in love and in silence. To this day, no one has found Moses' grave, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be, because the story of Moses does not rest in a tomb. It lives in every soul who walks by faith, and his final breath, taken on a lonely mountain in the presence of God, still echoes with the glory of a life fully poured out. Yet beyond the burial, one truth loomed too large to ignore. The relationship Moses had with God was unlike any other. Before Israel could move forward, before Joshua could rise, before the Jordan would part, the narrative itself stops as if time stands still. A divine silence falls over the page. Because the death of Moses was not just the end of a life, it was the end of a relationship unlike any other in human history. Moses was not merely a prophet. He was a friend of God. The book of Deuteronomy makes this staggering declaration. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 10. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was literal. Moses spoke with God face to face, not through visions, not through dreams, not in riddles, but in direct, intimate communion. The Lord himself testified in Numbers, chapter 12, verse 8, "With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in dark speech, and he beholds the form of the Lord." In all of Scripture, no one else, not even Elijah, not David, not the apostles, ever experienced God like Moses did. His relationship with the Almighty was so profound that his face would physically shine after being in God's presence, so radiant in fact, that he had to wear a veil to shield the people from the glory left upon his skin. Exodus chapter 34 verse 29 to 35. Moses didn't just know about God, he walked with him, wept before him, argued with him, pleaded with him. He stood on Mount Sinai amid fire and cloud, receiving commandments carved by the very finger of God. He stood in the tent of meeting where the pillar of cloud descended and the Lord would speak with him, as a man speaks with his friend. No curtains, no intermediaries, no fear, just faith and friendship. And yet that intimacy came with unbearable weight. Moses bore the burden of mediating between a holy God and a rebellious people. When Israel built the golden calf, it was Moses who interceded. He fasted 40 days, pleading for God to spare the nation. At times he even offered his own life in exchange for theirs, crying out, "If you will not forgive them, blot me out of your book which you have written." Exodus chapter 32 verse 32. He was a man caught between divine fire and human frailty. It was through Moses that the power of heaven was unleashed on earth. He called down plagues on Egypt, parting seas and shattering idols. He lifted his staff and watched waters divide. He stretched his hands, and the earth quaked. He spoke, and bread rained from heaven. Water burst from rocks at his word. Armies were defeated when his hands remained lifted. The laws, the festivals, the tabernacle, all were given through him. Every movement of Israel's identity as a nation was etched by his obedience. And yet, Moses was not perfect. He struck the rock in anger when he was told to speak. For that one act of disobedience, he was denied entry into the promised land. But even in that discipline, God's love for Moses did not waver. His burial by God's hand was the final testimony of that bond. His exclusion from Canaan was not a rejection but a divine mystery, a reminder that even the greatest prophet remains subject to the holiness of God. Still, after Moses' death, the Bible leaves no room for comparison. The sacred record closes the chapter with these thunderous words, "No one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 12. Even centuries later, when the transfigured Christ would stand on a mountaintop in glory, it was Moses who appeared beside him, speaking with the Messiah face to face once again. Matthew chapter 17 verse 3. Even in glory, the intimacy continued. So what makes this moment so shocking? Not just that such a relationship ever existed, but that it ended. That God's closest human companion, the man who had seen his glory and heard his voice like no other, was suddenly gone. His voice silenced, his staff laid down, his light extinguished, and the God who had spoken to him as a friend now buried him in secret, as if to preserve the holiness of what they had shared. Moses' relationship with God wasn't just remarkable, it was unmatched, unrepeatable, and its ending marked the closing of one of the most sacred bonds ever recorded in human history. But the fingerprints of that friendship didn't fade with his death. They remain on every law, every command, every covenant he delivered. They remain in the nation he led, and they remain in the pages of Scripture as a testament to what happens when a human life dares to walk face to face with the divine. Then came a stillness across the land, a nation brought to its knees by the weight of loss. The moment the news spread, Moses is dead, a profound silence fell over the nation of Israel. It was more than the loss of a man, it was the loss of a voice, a presence, a pillar of identity. For over 40 years, through scorching wilderness and bitter rebellion, Moses had been the unshakable center of Israel's journey. He was the man who defied Pharaoh, the leader who walked them out of slavery with nothing but a staff and the promises of God. He was their legislator, delivering the 10 Commandments carved by divine fire. He was their intercessor, standing between them and divine wrath when they sinned. He was their guide, who never stopped leading, even when they turned their backs on him. And now, he was gone. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. In the vast, dusty plains of Moab, the entire nation halted. The sound of movement, of preparation, of marching ceased. No trumpets rang. No commands were shouted. What remained was a heavy stillness, broken only by the quiet sobs of a grieving people. The Bible tells us they mourned for 30 days, a full month of national lamentation, Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 8. This was not a symbolic gesture, this was soul-deep mourning. A generation that had once danced after the Red Sea's parting now wept openly, remembering the prophet who had led them there. These were people who had heard his voice thunder from mountaintops, who had seen his face glow with glory, who had been rebuked by him, forgiven through him, and taught by his wisdom. And now they sat in dust and ashes, confronted with a future that no longer included him. This marked the third of 5 shocking moments after Moses' death. Israel, so often rebellious, now sat in unified, reverent grief. The same people who had once threatened to stone Moses in frustration now wept because he was no more. Their mourning was not born of fear, but of recognition. They finally saw clearly what he had been all along, a man who stood in the gap, who had given his life to hold them together. All throughout the camp, stories were told. Elders recalled the miracles, how Moses lifted his staff and waters split, how he struck the rock and water burst forth, how manna fell every morning because of the prayers of one man. Fathers taught their sons about the tablets of stone, about the fire on Mount Sinai. Mothers whispered his name to their children, telling them not just what he did, but who he was. For 30 days, Israel looked backward, and in that backward glance they realized something profound. Moses was not just their prophet, he was their connection to God. He had been the one to speak when they were too afraid to hear the voice of the Almighty. He had stood alone on the mountain so they would not perish. His absence now forced them to reckon with a terrifying truth. There would be no more Moses to stand between them and the holiness of God. But this time of mourning wasn't just about grief, it was about identity. Who would they be without him? Could the nation survive without the prophet who had held it together in its most fragile moments? This wasn't just a funeral season, it was a national reckoning. For the generation that had been born in the wilderness, Moses was all they had known. For many, he had been the only spiritual voice in their lives. His death didn't just signal an ending, it posed a question. Now that Moses is gone, who are we? And perhaps most shocking of all was that this question remained unanswered for 30 days. There was no immediate declaration of new leadership, no new law, no prophetic voice rose during their mourning. The heavens were quiet, the people waited. But even in that silence, something sacred was happening. A nation was remembering, a nation was reflecting, a nation was being prepared for transition. Because though Moses had died, God had not. And in the ache of loss, in the silence of grief, A new chapter was quietly preparing to unfold. The mourning of Israel wasn't weakness, it was reverence. It was the necessary pause before the next move of God. And it remains one of the most shocking yet beautiful realities in Scripture, that an entire nation stopped, wept, and remembered a man who had led them not just through wilderness, but into the presence of the living God. But while sorrow filled the camp, God had already whispered his next command. While the people mourned Moses' death in the plains of Moab, something even more unexpected had already begun to unfold behind the scenes. A shockingly seamless transfer of leadership, orchestrated not by human politics or tribal consensus, but by the direct will of God. Long before Moses breathed his last breath, the Lord had prepared his successor. This was not an afterthought, this was divine foresight. God commanded Moses in Numbers, chapter 27, verse 18 to 20, "Take Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Give him some of your authority, so the whole Israelite community will obey him." Moses, the mighty deliverer, was instructed not to simply die, but to prepare the next in line. And that man was Joshua, the son of Nun, a name that means Yahweh is salvation, a name that foreshadowed everything he was about to become. This wasn't a random appointment. Joshua had been faithful in the shadows long before he was called to stand in the light. He was Moses' assistant, his trusted servant and military commander. He had fought the Amalekites while Moses held up his hands on the hilltop. He had climbed partway up Mount Sinai when Moses received the law. He had stood guard at the tent of meeting, lingering near the presence of God long after Moses had departed. And when 12 spies were sent to scout the land of Canaan, only Joshua and Caleb returned with courage, proclaiming in faith, "Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it." Numbers chapter 13 verse 30. When others saw giants, Joshua saw God. And now, in the wake of Moses' death, that same vision was handed to him. But here lies the shock. The people, who were known for their constant complaining, rebellion, and resistance, did not protest. There was no uprising, no tribal chaos, no power struggle. Scripture tells us simply and astonishingly that the people accepted Joshua, and Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 9. This was not a mere ceremonial handover, this was a spiritual transference of power. When Moses laid his hands upon Joshua, something invisible yet undeniable passed from one to the other. The authority that once parted seas, confronted kings, and carried covenant tablets now rested on Joshua's shoulders, not in equal measure but in divine continuation. And what's even more astonishing is how Joshua responded. He did not promote himself. He did not boast in his title. He did not seek to imitate Moses' style. Instead, he waited. He listened. He allowed the mourning of Moses to finish. Only then, with reverence, did he begin to lead. This shift in leadership was not chaotic, it was holy. It was a rare moment in history when the change of leadership did not fracture a nation, but preserved it. Why? Because this wasn't human succession, it was covenantal succession. This was not Israel choosing a new leader. This was God continuing his story. What began at the burning bush had now moved into a new vessel. The flame that had once danced before Moses now kindled within the heart of Joshua. And this was not just the passing of responsibility, it was the passing of promise. And perhaps the most shocking moment of all, Joshua was not another Moses. And that's exactly what Israel needed. He didn't need to be. He wasn't called to climb mountains and receive law. He was called to cross rivers and claim territory. His was not the season of formation, but of fulfillment. What Moses began, Joshua would complete. This divine transition is one of the most surprising and powerful moments in Israel's history, not because it was dramatic, but because it was peaceful. A rebellious nation, under the grief of losing its greatest prophet, quietly accepted a new leader, not because of charisma or power, but because they saw that the same Spirit who had rested on Moses now rested on Joshua. This wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a passing of fire, a continuation of covenant, a signal to Israel and to the world that though God's servants may die, God's mission never does. Finally, the moment had come. A nation once wandering now stood on the edge of destiny. The mourning had ended, The great prophet was gone. A new leader had risen, and now, for the first time in decades, the people of Israel turned not backward, but forward, their eyes, weary from wandering, lifted toward a new horizon. And there it was, the Jordan River. It surged like a living boundary, wide, swollen with spring floodwaters, wild and unpredictable. To cross it was to leave behind everything familiar, the wilderness, the wandering, the manna, the mourning. To cross it was to enter a new identity, a new calling, and a new chapter in God's covenant plan. But the shock was not the river's size. It was this: they were finally ready. After centuries of slavery and 40 years of wilderness discipline, Israel stood on the edge of destiny, not as refugees, but as a nation prepared. Under Joshua's command, a strategic and spiritual mobilization began. The leadership didn't rush in recklessly. They didn't presume victory. They paused, obeyed, and listened for God's instruction. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim and came to the Jordan. He and all the children of Israel lodged there before they crossed over. Joshua chapter 3 verse 1. The first command was spiritual, not tactical. Sanctify yourselves, Joshua said, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. Joshua chapter 3 verse 5. This was shocking in itself. They were on the verge of battle, yet they were told to purify, not sharpen swords. They were not preparing with military drills, but with holy reverence, because the conquest of Canaan would not begin with weapons, but with worship and faith. The priests were summoned, and the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that held the 10 Commandments, the manna and the rod of Aaron, was lifted onto their shoulders. It would lead the way. Not Joshua, not the soldiers, but the presence of God himself. This wasn't strategy, it was theology. God would go first. Just as he had led them with cloud and fire through the wilderness, now his presence would part the waters once again. The Red Sea was Moses' miracle. The Jordan would be Joshua's. As the people gathered behind the ark, a holy tension filled the air. This generation had never known Egypt. They had been born in the wilderness, but they had grown strong there, hardened by journey, humbled by discipline, taught to trust not in themselves, but in the voice of the Lord. They were not the same people who had once trembled before giants. They had changed. They had learned to bury the past. They had learned to follow the cloud. They had learned that victory came not from strength, but from surrender. And now they stood at the edge, not just of a river, but of a promise first spoken to Abraham more than 400 years earlier. A land of vineyards they did not plant, wells they did not dig, cities they did not build, a land flowing with milk and honey and soaked in the words of divine covenant. But this wasn't just about territory, this was about identity. To enter the land was to become the people God had always intended. To inherit the promise was to embrace the responsibility of it. To cross the Jordan was to declare, we are no longer wanderers, we are sons and daughters of promise. And so they consecrated themselves, not just with ritual but with remembrance. They remembered the God who had delivered them from Egypt with plagues. They remembered the mountain that shook with fire. They remembered the rebellion and the mercy, the law and the blood, the failures and the forgiveness. And in that memory they stood, poised between what had been and what would now begin. This wasn't just the start of a military campaign, it was the climax of prophecy, the convergence of centuries, the crossing into destiny. What began in a promise to Abraham, what endured through the cries of slavery, what survived the wilderness of sin, was now about to be fulfilled. And it all began right after Moses died. Because when one era ends under the hand of God, another rises in its place, not by human power but by divine plan. And so they waited, at the edge of the river, with hearts consecrated, with eyes on the ark, and with heaven preparing to move. What followed Moses' death wasn't collapse, it was calling, not disorder, but divine design. These weren't just events in history, they were moments of heaven touching earth. In 5 stunning movements, we saw God bury his prophet in secret, Israel mourn in unified silence, leadership pass without protest, and a new generation rise with hearts consecrated, standing on the banks of fulfillment. Because in God's kingdom, even death serves the story, and the ending of one man's journey became the beginning of a nation's inheritance. So if this story gave you a deeper appreciation for God's timing, His leadership, and the way He moves even in moments of loss, don't let it stop here. Please like this video to let others know it matters. Comment below with your thoughts or reflections. I'd love to hear how this impacted you. Subscribe for more powerful biblical storytelling that brings forgotten revelations to light. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that God never stops writing His story, even after we think it's over. Thank you for watching. Truly, your time, your presence, and your faith mean more than you know. Until next time, walk boldly, trust deeply, and remember, even the end of a prophet can be the beginning of a promise. Grace and peace be with you always.